there is a dynamic in terms of the split that goes on, which is not just in the UK, where there's never been as much public support, sympathy, and informed understanding of the Palestinian cause as ever before within the general public. But there has also never been as much hostility, funding, and capture of the main political parties as there is at the moment. There's been a widening of the public order offences, which were used in recent demonstrations, where a lot of the demonstrators said it felt like a trap. So the crackdown is sinister and it's there. There's a lot of censorship at schools, but the climate overall is kind of ominous.
Welcome to the Ehkili podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Palestinian writer Selma Dabbagh, who is the author behind Out of It, as well as the editor behind We Wrote in Symbols, Love and Lust by Arab Women Writers. Welcome, Selma.
Thank you, Mikey. It's good to be here.
I should say this is being recorded on Wednesday, March 26th. I think it's coming out in a couple of weeks, but just so people know the state of the world when we're talking, because things can change, obviously. I think the first question is, how are you?
Gosh, that's a complex question. It's sometimes the hardest one. I think I'm I'm very up and down. I'm keeping myself busy, and I'm very appreciative of my level of privilege, I guess, at this point in time. I don't know whether I'm going through some sort of process of dissociation and trying to pretend that things aren't as bad as they are. And then you get waves, when you see the news or you look at social media or you catch one clip and I don't know, it can really knock you sideways, I guess. But I don't think I'm definitely not alone on this. We're all going through a kind of psychic ordeal, as Pankaj Mishra puts it.
I want to start by asking you about something that a lot of people who may come across your work, me included, are surprised by, which is the fact that you're a lawyer.
Okay.
I wonder how much your experience as a lawyer influences the way you think about storytelling and the way you think about your work as a writer.
Thank you for that question. I think I'd always wanted to be a writer, but I come from a family which is, my dad's Palestinian, and it was kind of the idea that you had to have a profession, a vocation. You don't go to university to study like literature, for example. That was my generation. I think it's changed a bit. So being a lawyer was like the idea of having a career which could help support me in my writing work. In terms of how it influences the way I write, I try not to let it influence me during the first drafts of writing. I try to really close down that part of my brain, which is the stricter, the more fact-based, the more evidential. And I try to sort of freely kind of connect ideas and landscapes in a way that is just more creative and more free-flowing. I think the lawyering comes in when it comes to the kind of research that I have. I think it probably comes through the groundwork in terms of my outlook, my previous outlook on how the world should run has a sort of basic underlying belief in international legal systems and a rules-based order, which, even though I'm quite inclined to say that, parts of it should be changed, it's got colonial roots that I was upholding a lot, I guess, in terms of the way that I write as an insider-outsider, partly appealing to, English language audiences who might not be as familiar with the terrains of my stories as that. But in terms of my training as a criminal lawyer, this is one specific thing. It's quite useful in terms of having read a lot of unreliable witness testimony, in terms of if you're presenting a perspective from somebody who's standing in a certain place, you think about things like, how likely is it that they'll be able to see the things that they're explaining that they're seeing? Is there going to be a tree in the way? I often have sort of, like plots or plans of the fictional terrain that I'm working with to ensure that, you know, one can move around it, one can navigate it in the way that I'm presenting. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you, if I had interviewed you or if I had met you sort of in an airport or on the street at the bus stop and asked you what you wanted to be in 2005 or 2007, would you have been able to admit that, yeah, I want to be a writer for sure?
Yeah, definitely by 2005, 2007, yes. I'd already started writing some short stories, which had been published in Ireland, actually. I was living in Bahrain at the time. I was working 2005, 7, so I had my kids were quite young. I was basically like a corporate housewife. It wasn't really where I wanted to be. In fact, like there's a bio that I gave for an anthology in around 2003 where I said I was living, you know, that this was my first short story. I was living plan B, and my, you know, plan A was that it wouldn't be my last piece of fiction writing. So that's, you know, that's something I've done. You sometimes have to remind yourself, 'cause you're always kind of thinking, what's the next thing you want to do? You sometimes have to think, well, actually, if I look back, you know, this is kind of where I wanted to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you had very kindly sent me something that you had prepared at some talk that you were giving, Cunning Encounters, where you at some point described literature as a route to self-inquiry.
Hmm.
Tell me a little bit about what you mean by that and how you think that actually, because this is, for afikra, this is like a very meaningful thing insofar as we're exclusively looking at intellectual curiosity and the act of inquiring. And I'm curious what you think, what that means for you.
Yeah, great question. I mean, for me, when you are presenting a scene in fiction,
Yeah.
one of the writers whose work on fiction writing I really learned a lot from is a guy called David Lodge, English writer, but he was sort of talking about the 7 levels of consciousness. So that any one point in time, I could be like aware that I'm talking to you. I could be partly listening out for noises outside. I could be thinking about, you know, later on in the day. But then there's also, you know, that there are different levels, or are conscious of the touch of the table, or so you have these different levels going on, and for any particular moment in time the writer has to kind of plug into which level might be most appropriate to get to describe this moment in a unique and fresh way, so that it's not cliched, so that it's communicating emotion and reality, and it's also dealing with the conflicts within you. Because sometimes you're often, you know, however much you want to be natural, you're often very much influenced by the societal like pressures upon you, or the group that you're with, or the into complying and having a sort of level of psychological dissonance between how you're meant to be presenting yourself and how you're actually feeling. So I think this constant process as a fiction writer of trying to drill down into like, what am I actually feeling, and what am I, you know, what are my suppressed emotions here and feelings of disquiet or discomfort or elation, which I can't show within this environment. And why is that? Because the interior life is something that I think fiction can explore far more than any other medium, except for perhaps poetry. So it's a kind of breaking down, a recalibration, and a trying to constantly fine tune that I think leads to a level of self inquiry.
It's funny because the reason why I ask is because I wonder yourself is obviously a self is comprised of a lot of different parts, and one of the parts that, and for the sake of this interview at least, is your connection to Palestine. And I'm curious about how you sort of interrogate and question that relationship for yourself. Like, how do you connect to this place in your imagination? How do you connect to the other community of people who care about this place when you do that writing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, I mean, it's it's something that I explore quite a lot in Out of It, my novel. There's this idea of there's something about being Palestinian, which means that even if you try to move away from it, you won't be allowed to, because it will be pushed back at you by other people. This is what the characters feel when they go to the West, and one of them really wants to disengage from any political involvement, but yet they're constantly coming up against misunderstandings and this, you know, this internal suppressed self of kind of raging about what's going on that they're constantly conscious of. And I felt that that for me was interesting because it's like how Palestinians are connected all over the world, is that they might not even present themselves as being Palestinian, but there's probably an awareness there as to what is going on, particularly in the last 2-3 years. So there's that kind of like people can come to being Palestine at different stages of their life. And definitely at points in time it's been more forefront in my life than at other times. And probably for me, the more I'm in the West, the more I feel it, because you notice more that which is not fitting in than that which is fitting in. If I was probably among a group of Palestinians in Jerusalem, they might not view me as particularly Palestinian at all. I know that, and that it does. I mean, I must say it does kind of hurt, because you just know that you're just going to be seen as a sort of a bit of an outsider. But it's I think it's also with being Palestinian, it's away from, if you go away from the specifics, it's a way of being informed about the world order of things, and it's a way that has informed my politics. And to go back with the kind of work I did as a lawyer, a lot of it was civil actions against the police and race and sex discrimination. So the idea of always wanting to stand up for the unspoken for, or the underdog, or however you want to see it, that's informed that part of my life. But it's not a it's not something I feel that in certain circumstances I feel very that the right thing to do is to sort of not present myself as that in a group where there are people with far greater connections to land and the struggle and resist. You know, that for me, I just feel I'm on one part of a struggle, which is just has knowledge of one particular area of work that I can do, and that's how I carve myself out. You know, yeah. I mean, going back to privilege, I guess it's
Yeah.
really about that.
I want to talk about Out of It. Where did that story come from for you?
An image I like. It was the second Gulf War, 2003. I was in Bahrain. I was thinking a lot about Iraq, and Jenin had been bombed. So I had like this image of a young boy on a roof who was like a little bit stoned and just wanted, you know, there were fighter jets above him, and he just knew he didn't want to be there, and he knew other worlds, but he didn't know what he could do. So it was like a kind of leaping image. And then it was the concept, which I just, you know, touched on, about this idea of so many things divide us as Palestinians. What's the thing that connects us? And for me, the things that connects us is our own emotional relationship with our political engagement, which is quite specific. I mean, it's now, it's not, I think now it's broadening, you know, sadly, because of the state of so many other places, that a lot of Lebanese will identify with this, or Syrians, or Egyptians. It's like you want to be part of a movement for change, but the geographical restrictions on being there are so huge, but you can't, and so you kind of want to unload yourself from that burden, or to find a way of meaningfully engage, but you don't know how to do that, and it's as difficult outside of where you're from as within it sometimes, to find that balance, that space, that meaningful connection to your consciousness, you know. So the Out of It was out of it, like stoned, you know, wanting to kind of switch off, out of it, out of the geography, and also out of political engagement,
Yeah. Out of the game.
the game, if you can be.
Yeah.
I've concluded you can't.
You know, I always wonder how it must feel when you see when a book like this gets praised in Western media,
Hmm.
does it sting in some weird way?
Um, I think it depends on where it comes from. I can't say that. I mean, I got some negative reviews as well who said that I was really anti-British. Did you see
Do
those?
those feel good?
I was so outraged. It's like what, and they were sort of implying I was anti-Semitic because of that I was there was an identification by one character with of the Nakba with the Holocaust in terms
Yeah.
of the methods used in 48. And I was so outraged and I wanted to kind of write back and, provide all of the resources to show that other people had said this. It was perfectly well documented. But there's no elegant way to reply to a negative review.
No, you got to stay out of the comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sting is a bigger thing. The sting is becoming more and more in my head recently. It's like, what role am I fulfilling, whether knowingly or unknowingly, in the work that I do, in the way that I present myself, in are you the sort of token Palestinian who's sort of whitewashing I mean, that's your ultimate fear. And how do you decide whether a venue that you go and speak in, apart from the general sort of BDS principles which I adhere to, how do you decide whether you're going to be doing more by cooperating and being part of it and hoping that that can bring some degree of change somewhere along the line, or are you better rejecting it, confronting it from the outside? I mean, this is something that goes on and on from the mandate period with the relationship to, like, the British. Like, do you cooperate in the committees? Do you agree, do you talk to them or do you just fight, right? So it's
Are you out of it or not?
are you out of it? Are you in the process that
Yeah.
is giving you a notional idea of having a voice? But I mean, I generally sort of have believed that there's a purpose in keeping that door open and hoping that it will influence change. But when you see the degree of complicity and collaboration in terms of what's happening at the moment with the British government, you just feel that that there's that the kind of the moral argument has been moral and legal arguments have been dropped out of current politics.
Yeah. The reason why I ask about it stinging or not is because I can imagine like a book like Out of It that gets heralded as rightfully heralded as a fantastic book to understand Israel and Palestine,
Wow. Hmm.
or one of the top 10 books to understand revolution, right?
Oh, well, that was, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry, can I just go back to the first one?
Please.
The first one, which I know what you're talking about. So the Guardian listed it as one of the top 5 books to understand Palestine, Israel, and I was really pleased with that because it was like 10 years after it came out. But it's also like I wrote that from the outside. I have constantly said this is a fictive Gaza. It's set between this fictive Gaza,
Yeah.
London, and the Gulf, right? It's like a composite of what
Yeah.
was going on. It's not a real account. If you want real accounts, read Gazan writers. I am not a Gazan writer. I've said that all the time, but obviously it's like you get jammed into the publicity machine takes on. The other one was my top 10 reluctant revolutionaries. That was a piece by me. So sort
Yeah.
of looking at other works. Yeah.
But I want to talk about just the idea of these lists and why they might sting is specifically coming from Western, not obviously the list you put together,
Yeah.
but specifically coming from Western publications where I don't know if it ever feels like read 35 books. Don't stop it.
Where do you start? One
Read
track.
55 books. Like
Yeah.
like you
Oh,
gotta, like, please do the work, like catch
yeah.
up, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's what, like, Mahmoud Munner of the Educational Bookshop in Jerusalem, who was recently arrested and stuff. He said that, everybody would just come into the bookshop and say, can you give me something really short on Palestine? And these are journalists. These are
Yeah.
like, they're out there and, I don't know
Yeah.
how many thousand were there in like October 23, none of them getting into Gaza, none of them seeing, anyway, that's another thing I could rant about. But there are lots
No.
of stings. It's just, there are lots of things where you don't know what to do with your anger. I mean, it's like if you're in this for the long game, you've got to look after yourself. You've got to think like, okay, how do I bring up that point and where do I bring up that point? And
Yeah.
is this the time to say, great, okay, thanks for that. That will help me to continue to publish and give me more confidence to be able to push on the areas where I really want to push,
Yeah.
just have that backing. Would you say, right, I'm going to go for you and say, screw you now? I mean,
Yeah. One of the things that I feel like a lot of writers and storytellers, academics, scholars, even people like me are thinking about is this idea of fighting erasure, and telling our stories, whether they're fictional or nonfiction, but telling the truth about these places and this culture and allowing that representation. In a way, there's a burden that comes with that,
mhm.
right? Because you can't, maybe you feel like there is some, you're not allowed to sort of like wander off. Um, how have you sort of navigated that idea of, okay, wait, hold on, I need to fight this erasure, um, but I also need to um, imagine.
Great question. I've wrestled with this one a lot. I think, okay, several things which go on here. I think with there's always going to be a responsibility if you are moving into a space where there are very few people representing it and there's a huge amount of misrepresentation.
Mm-hmm.
When I read around a lot about, different interviews with different writers on not just on Palestine, on all kinds of different political settings, fiction writers, how they struck a balance. My own one was the idea that you should try and be responsible, like try to make sure you're not kind of being kind of like supercilious or superior or like digging, recreating the same images that the media was reliant upon. I don't know whether I altogether succeeded on that
Mm.
one. There are some things I would tweak now if I was to go back, which I can come back to that point. It's about suicide bombing. There's the other thing is I felt okay responsibility, and I also thought and the responsibility also goes a lot into how much do you research, how many materials, who are those materials by, when were they written, so that you can get the kind of the voices and the kind of things that were going on. So I read a lot of memoirs and interviews with people who'd lived through the first and second intifadas,
Mm.
as well as people I know. And then the second one is just as a sensitivity. So it's a responsibility and the sensitivity. And then you have, particularly with Palestine, I think more so than any other country where the erasure has been so dramatic, right? Your Zionists said we didn't exist, and then even if we did exist, doesn't matter if, they can be, even if they existed, they were mobile, could be
Yeah.
moved off easily. Um, because that's so extreme, I think that the national movement has sort of relied very heavily. Like we don't have the politics, we don't have the power, we don't have the economy. What we've got the legal, we've got the moral argument, right? So people got very possessive. I think it's less than when I started writing. Very possessive that this story had to be told exactly, right? So and you couldn't miss one thing because it was dismantling it, and that was quite hard to tackle. So and initially I'd wanted to write from 48 onwards, and then I decided no, I want now, and then with
Mm.
flashbacks. With What I would say is that I got to a point with my early drafts which had a lot of dense material on explaining historical points. And I decided if any of those parts did not either feed into plot or character, I was going to cut them, even if I'd spent months like rewriting the sections. And then somebody once gave me this advice, a writer, Maggie G. She was like saying, turn it into art and play. You have to get to a point where it's like, okay, let's breathe some life into this. Otherwise, it gets a kind of level of didactic nature. And Chinua Achebe, writes about this. You can't just have angelic creatures. You also need devils. You need
Yeah.
people, because life is what life is. I mean, some people you get sort of extreme elements of behavior in extreme conditions, like real extraordinary goodness and heroism, but also real duplicity and corruption, right?
Yeah, it's the nature of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, it's what is this? What is the climate? I want to change gears a little
Yeah.
bit because I think it'll be useful. What's the climate like in the UK for you?
Um, well, it's getting kind of, I don't know, I had a nightmare last night, which was really, I mean, there's a lot of overuse of the Terrorism Act, as opposed to other criminal legislation against people defending Palestinian rights.
Hmm.
There's been a widening of the public order offences, which were used in recent demonstrations, where a lot of the demonstrators said it felt like a trap. Where they, on January the 18th, where they picked up 77 people. Um, there have been, so the crackdown is sinister and it's there.
Is this mostly in London or it's
It's
all
all
over the
over the
kingdom?
country. I would say what I'm hearing in terms of the climate for academics, in academia, the people being targeted are normally young women of color. That seems to be a sort of soft target to go for in terms of dismissals or investigations into them. Um, there's a lot of censorship at schools. There's a lot of lack of censorship of the other side's narrative, which is being promoted in educational environments. There's a lot of funding for groups on the other side and limited funds on our side. I think there's been so it's the groups that I think I'm very lucky because I'm in London, which is the metropolis,
Mm-hmm.
and here we have, as opposed to the US, we have a lot of groups working in this area who are in the city. There, a lot of my friends work for them. I work for them. We're all like very closely knit and give each other a lot of support. But the climate overall is kind of ominous.
Yeah. Do you feel like it's becoming bifurcated essentially, where there is a larger group of people who understand more than ever,
Hmm.
and then there's a larger group of people who are agitated and ready to be violent. Um, the reason why I ask is, I mean, you have this blog on London Review of Books,
Hmm.
and I wonder if that blog would exist 10 years ago, or 15 years ago.
Um, well, one thing I'd like to say is like just there is a dynamic in terms of the split that goes on, which is not just in the UK, where there's never been as much public support, sympathy, and informed understanding of the Palestinian cause as ever before within the general public. But there
Yeah.
has also never been as much hostility, funding, and capture of the main political parties as there is at the moment. So you've got this, like 70% or more in this country were calling for a ceasefire last year. And then, but you don't get any politicians, really, very few. I mean, the ones who are doing it, fantastic, amazing. Some of them have been rooted out since from both major parties. So that I've also felt the same in terms of, I mean, I felt the same in other countries that I've been to. Okay, so that's one thing. With the LRB, I mean, one often wonders like, how did that happen, and how did it happen for so long? Um, and they are really keen for me to continue, and they haven't. I haven't felt any censoring down of my content on political lines. They don't like it when I have too much of the the personal. That's just their house style. They kind of um, but as long as I'm evidence checking it, they're allowing for it. I am grateful to have that space, and I hope that it's getting to a certain kind of liberal elite who used to be able to kind of fudge their sympathy for Israel on the basis of like we're waiting for a two-state solution. They're not that bad. It's just Likud. It's not Labour wouldn't do this. Just give them more time. I think you can't run that anymore. And I'm giving these people evidence. Anyone who's in, I hope that these that there's some push. I'm giving people the kind of evidence to push in private circles where it matters for some kind of change. People who do want to be seen to be doing morally and legally the right thing. Even though they might be these sort of intelligentsia, they might be a dying class anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, to go back to your point about the sting of like go off and read 35 books, the thing I get agitated about is not just how much people read or they don't read. It's like when they've got that information, when it matters, when they're in that moment, be it at their place of employment or be it in a private discussion where they should be bringing it up, that kind of like I want them to get over that horror of not being polite or horror of upsetting people about something small, and really sort of that divide, which should be, we're all constantly interrogating ourselves about this stuff, and I'm not as good as it as I'd like to be, but I think that's where I want more people to be kind of engaging, even if it's on minimal information. I mean, you don't need a lot of information to be able to see what's going on now is just unconscionably wrong and evil and has to be stopped, right?
Yeah.
It's really not very complicated.
I'm thinking about, I want to go back to these 35 books because in a few of the articles online, you go out of your way to do a service, which I love, which is to highlight books that people should be reading, authors that people should be reading, saying there isn't only one genre called Palestinian, not even Palestinian literature, Palestinian books. There's this like illusion that there's one genre of story that you can tell, and only one way you can tell it. So if I can put you on the spot, can you name some books or some authors off the top of your head that you're like, here is a broader list?
Sure. Do you mean on like, do you mean fiction or non-fiction? Which one would you prefer?
Kind of both. I mean, this is inspired by the Port Magazine
Hmm.
discussion that you put
Yeah,
together. But just like a big picture, it can be authors, it can be books, it can be fiction, nonfiction, poetry, folks who post online that you're like, this is
yeah,
poetry, clearly.
yeah. Oh, there's so much, and I would be really happy to give a kind of list of my favorites for
Yeah,
you to attach to the podcast as well. But
we'll add
I
a
really,
list.
I think there's just so many writers who are now able to really explore more of who they are in the context of this, their sort of the national cause. So that there are a lot more personal pieces, a lot funnier pieces. So in terms of humor, I would say Mazin Ma'ruf, Notes from a Gunman, and from Palestinian from Lebanon. I also do a lot of Samia Issa's work is not translated very much. I've got a piece by her, Fig Milk, in my anthology, which is again set in a refugee camp. Soraya Antonius is a writer that I wrote part of my PhD on, and she's fallen out of publication. She wrote in the 80s in English, and her books, I'm really happy. I'm going to be writing the introduction for New York Review of Books for one of those novels, which are quite hard hitting. Anyone studying in the West of Palestinian or Arab origin or of a certain age, I would really recommend Namesake by Enes Nusseibeh. It's a series of essays about a number of issues, but like kind of microaggressions of Islamophobia, racism, and the complexities of being British Palestinian. Isabella Hammond's books are great on giving that sort of great epic overview. If you want the world that has been destroyed, the living culture of the camps and towns of Gaza, Ahmed Massoud's books, Disappeared, are great on that. Also, Saada Amari, mainly famous for Sharona, my mother-in-law, a series of emails she was sending her Italian friends, which are funny and great about the invasion of funny, great, tragic, but I find I cry more easily if I've been made to laugh by somebody. I find this in films as well.
Of
It's
course.
just, so humor is super important. How to navigate it is always, it's hard. In terms of plays, I really admire Nizar Zarbi. It's from Amir Nizar Zarbi. He's had some plays on in London. He's a Palestinian from, I think, Nazareth, which also has most of the main Palestinian filmmakers come from that city. In terms of non-fiction, I think Pape's little, 101 Idiot's Guide 2 are probably the best go-to place. Then Rashid Khaldi's book, also Nur Masalha on the history. And then, yeah, I mean, there are Raja Shahada also. If I meet somebody of a certain generation, sort of my generation, who knows nothing about Palestine, I would give them Palestinian walks, just particularly like somebody who's English, who likes to walk, because it's very clever, the device he uses of like explaining the layers of history, the layers of occupation, and also just the feeling of his character. This inspiration you get from how does somebody become so strong? Because one tries to rail against the kind of the victim depiction and to say that there's so much one can learn, there's so much strength here, without also falling into the superhero thing and saying they can put up with anything. So some writers really capture that. Definitely give you a list. I don't know if that's the right.
Amazing. That's fantastic. Um, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about we write in symbols. Um, where did the idea of this collection come from?
I have a lot of ideas all the time, and some of them get picked up, some of them don't. This one was I
Maybe
read.
introduce the idea and then tell
Yeah,
us a
so
little
I'll
bit of.
introduce the idea. So people see this as being a bit of an outlier from my Palestine work because it's a collection of writing on love and lust by Arab
Hmm.
women of Arab heritage from the pre-Islamic era to the current day, right?
Yeah,
It's
I
got a hundred.
misspoke by the way. We wrote in symbols. Excuse me.
Yeah, yeah, that's okay. So it's got 110 pieces in it, 73 writers, 35 of whom are living. And the older pieces are drawn mainly from two anthologies, one by Wissam al-Mugliji and another one by Abdullah al-Udhari. And I read the Abdullah al-Udhari classical poems by Arab women when I was living in Bahrain, and I was so shocked by the pieces which were about, particularly like were more sexually descriptive and demanding and playful. I'd never heard those voices before.
Hmm.
This is from the Jahiliyyah period as well as the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Andalusian periods. Um, because they were kind of like they didn't seem to be trying to provoke. They were just sort of saying this is kind of like where I'm at and this is what I need, and so that was one thing. And then the Mugliji anthology had more. And then post the Arab uprisings of 2011, there was so little that was coming out of the Arab world that seemed positive after the original elation.
Hmm.
And I kind of thought, well, I wanted to do something more kind of, I'd read a couple of books which were kind of sort of problematizing sexuality in the Arab world, like it was kind of like nothing works here, like people don't even fall in love, they don't, sex lives are dead, it's all like, and I just wanted to kind of push back a bit on that. And also because I'd found that one of the positive things since post 2011 was that more Arab women were writing with greater freedom, audacity, experimentality, and were able. So I wanted to sort of chart these different periods um, in history of women of Arab heritage, and
Yeah.
also I like this idea of how the two sides of the Mediterranean sort of learn off each other at different periods, and that this idea. I don't like this idea that you come from a place of sort of repression to a place of freedom. as one, that kind of continuum, and the other one being that all kind of liberation for women comes from like west to east,
Yeah.
like that we learn from them. Whereas actually it's been swapping backwards and forwards, and these things are cyclical. And also it shows how much culture can change. We can, it can change very quickly and
Yeah.
in both directions.
Yeah, it's not surprising that this is a post-Arab Spring um, idea insofar as it stands in face of the idea that was propagated that, oh, democracy is going to liberate our minds and our bodies, and we're going to finally be able to love and lust because of exclusively because of Western style democracy is going to come. And clearly that is obviously simplistic and if you scratch it the surface a little bit, quite racist.
Yeah.
It makes sense that that's where the context in which this idea sort of emerged.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether that, yeah, I did want to kind of counter that. I didn't like the idea of it. Yeah, I wanted to counter it as being something more organic. And I
Yeah,
think one of the best reviews I had for that, which I was really pleased with, was from a woman who worked in reproductive health in Egypt. And she was saying that there was so much shame around these issues that she couldn't even like talk to some of the women she was dealing with, and so that to try and ground things in older poems, traditions, ideas. And also I love this book by Abdul Wahab, sorry, Bourdiba from Tunisia, which took, it's a 1970s book, but he was like this kind of real radical in terms of looking at the old texts and looking at women's sexuality and history in Islam.
yeah,
So I just thought, it's always best to like kind of see organic roots of change and like look at one's own history in order to project one's own future.
yeah. Are there any? I mean, you sort of alluded to a few of the stories. Are there any that sort of live rent free in your brain that you sort of come back to often?
I think that Sami Isa one really stuck in my head because I think she gets, this is the one set in the refugee camp where there's a couple who can only meet in the latrines, and it's very, I don't know, there's a scene, it's so sort of beautiful but disgusting and sexual, and I don't know how she manages to pull that off in a page, but it also just, you kind of think about how intense and how complex everyone's interiority is,
Mm.
composed of desires and hopes and aspirations, both romantic and physical. And um, yeah, I guess I've been thinking about that one most. But also, I liked some of the kind of I mean, I liked all of them, otherwise they wouldn't be there. But I mean,
Yeah.
some of the older ones, I think Olaya Bint al Mahdi, some of hers, I think, are quite heartbreaking and really beautifully translated by Yasmin Seal.
Yeah. And the title comes from one of those one of her poems.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about the symbolism behind the title or the reason why that's the title?
Yeah, just the idea of kind of coded communications, ways of communicating that you hope will get you to a place of um, love and freedom and physical satisfaction in a way that can bypass the strictures that you place upon yourself and your environment might also place on you.
Yeah.
So just a way of, yeah, kind of, yeah, coded communications, I guess.
Can I read the stanza?
Please do. I don't, yeah.
So this is from Alaya bint al Mahdi. This is from 775 to 785, I believe. Um, We wrote in symbols amid those who were present, insinuations implied with no lines, but eyes recounting their suffering with imaginary hands on the parchment of hearts, on the parchments of hearts. Do any stanzas or any sort of sentences? I know I asked you this earlier, but I wonder because like I love lyrics, I love poetry, and there's like ones that just like stick, and I cannot get them out
Yeah.
of my head. Are there any ones that you just like, it just exists constantly?
I think the image, there's one where you've got this image of being stuck between gate and the door, like this sort of like this place of longing. I think that's Alea bint al-Mahdi as well. But I now want to ask you, which were the pieces that you liked in the anthology? If you're,
The older stuff I really like, just
mm,
because for me it sort of takes me to a time that seems so far away, like when you're reading an 11th century Andalusian Berber poet. And I have up one of the quotes, and it says, "If love and song were not spoiled by wine, I'd spend my time drinking glass after glass and get what I long for."
yeah,
I'm
very
like, this I can relate to.
yeah.
Ugh. But tell me why you feel like this book is not a departure um, from the rest of your work. Because I
Oh,
believe it's not, obviously, but explain to me why
yeah.
you think they're the same.
Well, I think, I mean, in some ways, it's always going to be, it is away from, it is away from the sort of geopolitical and Palestine specifically. But what I think the connection is this curiosity I have about bravery and what makes people able to challenge the people around them, the family around them, the community, the state. What risks are they prepared to take? And what styles do they adapt that they feel empowered by in order to do that? And how also there is a huge range of kind of, I suppose you could say, classes represented in the anthology, and some of them have are able to be far more daring, like Shuruk Amin in Kuwait, because they are just connected. They can take risks that other writers can't. And that also applies to the princesses like Ulayya bint al-Mahdi back in the older period. And then you have slave girls who are trying to use their language to confront and to use their wit in a way that makes them indispensable and desirable and have greater value. So it's like how is language used to push for greater freedom is interesting to me. And I think that applies when you look at activism, like what can you do? This takes us back to perhaps what we were talking about in the beginning. What can you do with your skill set in a style that you're confident about or can become increasingly skilled with regards to, that can push for change without taking, you know, risks that are extreme either for you or more, other for other people. So that sort of balancing act, I think, is quite an interesting one, both with these women, some of whom were sanctioned, one of whom, like one of the early slave girl poets, was killed. There were some, I mean, but I'll skip that aside. But you know that there's a whole kind of debate about like sort of taboos and taboo subjects and breaking
Mm.
taboos, which I kind of didn't really want to fall into that. But there's that, and then there are other women later on who had their books banned, who had threats made against them. There are some who've been, hauled before courts, etc. So it's like, how did they navigate this, and how also does these environments of repression influence your style? Because some of the more quiet and more sensual ones, the ones we have to really think about each word, which are basically sometimes even you could be reading the sort of sexual or sensual act into a description of buildings, like or description of a town or a landscape. So
Yeah. Um, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, what are you working on now? I mean, you're obviously writing a lot in terms of online, but are you working on any sort of longer projects or larger projects right now as well?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel. I'm nearly finished. Well, I'm working on the edits. So it's set in 1938 Jerusalem, um, and it's loosely inspired by a family who lived there in the 1930s, who were of they were sort of they spoke English and French and Arabic at home, and they were a very affluent family. And I think in terms of my background, sorry, I think that it's um, I try to find people who have characters who are between East, like Arab world and the West. It makes more sense to me because I'm writing in English. So it's I'm trying to find a juncture in time, and I chose 1938 when I'm trying to make the argument that things could have gone differently had a
Yeah.
couple of people spoken out and acted decisively at that point in time, that we could be in a different scenario now. And what were the things that inhibited them and propelled them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you write something like that, we talked about these like duplicitous, these characters who are a little shady and duplicitous. And, do you have to love your characters?
Not all of them, no. But I think you need to want to go. I think you want to go within them, but we've all got dark parts of our souls. So I think sometimes it can be quite more fun being inside the really nasty characters.
Yeah.
So yeah, sure, really, and inhabiting that place of evil and selfishness and destruction. Yeah.
I don't want to ask too many questions about the new
No,
book.
no, I really
Uh,
like. I'm really enjoying talking to you. I really
okay.
have more questions.
Can I ask you questions about the new book?
Yeah,
Is that allowed? Okay.
yeah.
Um, who are some of these characters? Are they sort of these this moment in time? So this is for people listening, pre World War II, obviously pre 1948, but so this is still within technically the British Mandate. Um, who are some of these characters who had the opportunity to slide a door and and create a different pathway?
Right. Well, the way the family itself that this is inspired by is the Antonius family. So it's George Antonius is the father.
Hmm.
I'm writing it mainly
He was
from
like
the.
the mayor of Jerusalem or something, right?
He worked for the. He wasn't mayor. That was the Khaldi.
Hmm.
He was
Yeah.
deported. Well, there were several during the mandate period, but so well, no. But what you're probably thinking of was he was secretary to the Mufti at one point. He also
Okay.
worked with the
Yeah.
British government in the Department of Education, even though and he was brilliant. I mean, he was like a kind of Edward Said of his time. He was really like. So he wrote the Arab Awakening. He was married to someone called Katie Nimmer, who was Syrian, mainly Syrian, Lebanese, a bit of Egyptian links. And then there's also, I think it was her mother had some Austrian British heritage. So very kind of international family and very rich. So there was a lot of money, and they lived in the house, which became the Shepherd Hotel. I don't know if you followed the Shepherd Hotel. It was taken over by settlers in 2006. It was a big house in East Jerusalem in Sheikh Jarrah. But I'd always been interested in this house since I first went to Jerusalem in the 90s, because it was it was just this abandoned, rather beautiful old building. And I was sort of directed towards Katie Nimmer by Salim Tamari when I was last in Palestine, which was sadly over 10 years ago now. And he said that Katie was an interesting character because she had these big parties where she'd mix the Brits and the Palestinians and some Jewish guests. the idea that there were people who could have changed the direction is disputed. I mean, I'm sure some historians would say, no, it was all set in motion because the British Mandate had this plan and there was nothing you could do. But what I was relying on was a letter from 1938 by George Antonius to
Oh,
some
of
British colleagues.
course. I know this letter. Sorry, continue the story. I love this. Okay, continue.
Okay, so in this letter, he said all this bloodshed could be changed if there weren't a couple, there are a few people who, if they could just stand up and say what they really think, then this could all be sort of stopped. So he had the feeling that there were people, and he was trying to lobby them very hard. So what I'm interested in is, what were the women's roles in this, like the daughter looking at it, and the mother who was like sort of curating these parties. Like, how do you bring people together in a way that you can influence them beyond the public sphere, in a way that you can change this direction? So the novel is like a build up to a party, like in the way that maybe Mrs. Dalloway or something is. But that's the basic premise, and they're trying to use all the methods we're still trying to use, like documentation of atrocities, writing to the media, socializing, persuading, private relationships, romantic relationship. How do we influence this group of people? That's the challenge of the household, yeah, but I mean,
So interesting.
yeah.
This hotel is, I just looked it up. It's spectacular. I mean, the house that was turned into the hotel.
It
Have
was.
you,
I've got a sorry, I'm just going to pull out. I've got an old luggage. I don't know if you can see this. Can you see that?
this
It's
is
like a
exactly
luggage
the
box.
image I'm looking at.
Is it? Is that what you found? Okay. That was it. So that was the house. It's now settlers have taken over the whole thing, and it's yeah,
Wow.
Ataric Kohanim, which were the bankrolled by Moscovitz. I don't know if you remember Moscovitz in the States. His wife, his widow, is now just as zealous as he was. But my first ideas about this novel was I was going to write it over 100 years. I was going to set it from the, like Moscovitz's background in they had they were Jews who fled Europe to a very German part of the US,
Yeah.
where they were facing like neo-Nazis, and then they lost about 80 members of their family in the Holocaust, and then he goes to California, makes loads of money as a doctor and as a gambling kind of. He had all these casinos, and then that money was used to fund the settlers. So you've got this kind of, it's exactly the thing that Simone Weil talks about, like this, the currency of oppression passing from one hand to the other, but that was just way too ambitious. I'm now setting it in 1 week. So it went from
Okay.
100
Yeah.
years to 1 week.
Amazing.
Well, we'll see.
Well, when do you think it's going to come out?
I have no idea. I mean, I'm hoping that I can get a good draft to my agent by, it will be the second draft that she sees by the summer. And then, yeah, who knows? Who knows? I don't really rely on any of these. One just has to see.
Yeah.
I mean, I like it.
I can't wait to read it. I'm excited about this.
Thank you.
So, Salma, thanks so much. Where can people find your stuff? I mean, there's the London blog, the London Review of Books blog, but other stuff that you think people should look up who are listening to this?
Oh, that's really good of you to ask. I think I've published 2 reviews and some other pieces with the Marquez review. I used to write a lot. I haven't done any recently. I used to write a lot on culture and Palestinian literature, culture, film, etc. for the Electronic Intifada. There was that piece on Port on Palestinian literature. Um, hmm, I had some plays, but they're not really accessible anymore. I've got yeah, I think my novel and We Wrote in Symbols are probably my main things, but I need to update my blog. It's not my blog, my website. It's a bit
Yeah,
outdated, but that might be a go-to place.
cool. Well, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And
No, it's
thanks for
really
doing your work.
thanks, and thanks for the questions, which were fantastic.